Good morning. How are you all doing today? Good, good, good. All right, yeah. Did you have a lot to process from yesterday? Uh-huh. Were you a little tired last night? Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. Then I'm doing my job. I'm giving you some stuff to think about, which makes me happy. Any lingering questions from yesterday that it's real burning to ask this morning? Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, good.
You mentioned the man that would turn his head.
Yeah.
I had a client that do that, and it's really jolting for me to know how to work with it. I'm wondering if you could say more about how you specifically work with it.
Yes, great question. We're actually going to dive into that pretty deeply today, but I'll repeat the question for people listening from afar. So the question is referring to a case that I mentioned yesterday with the man that was turning his head, and ultimately what we got to was the memory of flinching in getting ready to be hit by his father. And in somatic psychology, we work a lot with those repetitive gestures that we see in clients. And this afternoon, we are going to be diving in a bit more deeply to somatic psychology and looking at that, but I'll give you kind of a little teaser, which is that when we're working with repetitive gestures that we're observing in our clients, that typically what we see is that they repeat, they don't satisfy, they don't complete, and then we'll see them session after session. So it's something that we then become curious about. Is ultimately we want to invite the client to become curious about that as well. And sometimes when we're bringing attention to a repetitive movement, this could be hair twirling, this can be picking at fingers, right? Things that we start to observe in clients that start to get uncomfortable. It can evoke some shame when we initially point that out. So we want to be very wise as to the timing of how we bring something like that up. But the way that we work with it is to bring mindfulness to it, to increase the awareness, to actually repeat the movement consciously. And I think that's the key, is to take over the movement consciously, slow it down, and repeat it and see if you can become aware of what is the feeling of repeating the action. And if it's something that's creating harm, we would repeat it without the harm. So for example, if someone's really going after their fingers, I would say, can you really slow down that? I don't want you to hurt yourself and pick at the skin, but can you feel what's happening in your hands as you do that? I'll give another example of someone that kept covering their mouth. And when we repeated it and slowed it down, it was this feeling of like, oh, I shouldn't be speaking. It's not okay to have my voice, right? So you can stay with it, slow it down. Generally, you can also amplify it. If it's a very small movement, you can kind of make it larger. And we'll talk more about that when we get into somatic psychology. I want to speak to, welcome back Sally Collins from New York. So I'm glad to know that you're able to join us again. And the question that you asked about how do we care for ourselves, how do I care for myself in doing trauma work, we're also going to speak about that one this afternoon, and I'll go ahead and kind of wait to address that until we get to that section. But I'll say largely to the group here that built into today is we're going to talk about several different modalities and how we integrate these different modalities for working with complex PTSD. We're going to talk about a resilience model for this work, and we're also going to talk about the importance of self-care in doing this work because we're part of it. And so if we burn ourselves out, then our clients lose us as assets. And of course, you've put so much time and energy and money into being able to work in this profession. You want to be able to do it for a while. So that's a little bit of an overview for today. And let's dive in. Okay. So as I mentioned, we'll be looking at an integrative mind-body approach to trauma treatment, and the modalities that we're going to be discussing today include psychodynamic work, relational, interpersonal therapy, parts work, EMDR therapy, somatic therapy, CBT, DBT, and complementary and alternative medicine, mindfulness, and yoga, and also referring out with a team of health practitioners to work with some of the health issues and so forth. And when I was in my doctoral program and we were choosing our theoretical orientation, and I came back and I said, well, I want to do an integrative model, and that really was frowned upon at that time, this idea that, like, really you want to put together CBT and relational work? Well, those are two really different fields, and they have really different research bases, and how are you going to put this evidence-based practice together with, you know, something like parts work? And the honest truth is that, like, the more that I sat with that question, the more I said, I can't not do that, and was really able to work with my professors to get a buy-in and to talk about the difference between an eclectic model versus an integrative model. Because eclectic is often this kind of like smattering or picking and choosing and kind of jumping off from here or there, whereas an integrative model has a theoretical base. It has a foundation of really being wise to think, why am I choosing this intervention here and now, and how does it fit with what I'm doing over here, so that it doesn't leave the client feeling like, well, what am I going to get this week? You know, which Arielle am I going to get this week? Right? You know, and I don't want, you know, especially for our traumatized clients, they need reliability, they need consistency, they need to know that there's trustworthiness not only in the relationship, but also in the approach that we're taking. They need to know that they're in good hands, right? And that there is research that stands behind what it is that we're here to do together, so that I can stand assuredly and say, this will help. You're going to feel better. And there is some relief in knowing that someone's kind of taking your hand and guiding you through this process, because for people that come in and they have been having severe nightmares, or they have been having severe insomnia to the point at which they feel psychotic, right, which happens, having someone say, well, we might try this today, and if that doesn't work, then we'll try that. That doesn't feel safe, right? And so we want to start, and that's why everything is going to fall into that 3-stage approach that we spoke about yesterday. And to tell you the truth, everything is going to come on top of a relational base, and that's why we start there. Is that we need to know that the relational base really informs all of our other working that we're doing, and we're going to dive into that right now. So, in relational work, anyone in the room familiar with Philip Bromberg's work? He wrote a book called The Shadow of the Tsunami, and it's really an excellent book written about working with trauma survivors, people who've experienced trauma, and a relational understanding of what happens in the room, in the exchange. So what he says is that the task of the clinician is to accept what the client cannot yet accept, and to facilitate greater integration at a pace that the client can tolerate. And so when a client is telling you about an experience and you feel something like, whoa, I don't even know if I can wrap my mind around that. That was scary. Boy, how do I imagine if I went through that? Those kinds of questions that can come up when we hear about, I won't even list them, but when we hear about some of the horrific events that clients have experienced, that is actually a mirroring for what they are going through. And to be able to slowly breathe and to work with, I can be in the room with that. It might be frightening. I might need supervision or consultation, going back to self-care, right? But I can ultimately be in the room with that. And that ultimately we're going to work at a pace that the client can accommodate. And that might involve lots of resourcing. That might involve really never going into the details of the trauma, because you know what? That's not necessary. It can be re-traumatizing. We might just get the headline and be able to work with what's happening in the body. We're also going to explore in our relational base transference and countertransference. All right? And the way that clients are going to project onto us their mother, their father, their abuser. They're also going to project onto us the rescuer, the one that's going to save them from, the one that's going to have all the answers. Right? You get that one? What should I do today? We're also going to come into the room with our own countertransference, right? And what we bring into the room from our own histories, or what gets evoked in us as we're working with the client. Philip Bromberg says that reenactments are inevitable, that there are ways in which we're going to get pulled into the attachment dynamics, or the client is going to evoke feelings in us of wanting to reject them or wanting to save them, and that those may be reenactments of their own internal expectations and relational blueprints, and we want to be awake to that so that if a reenactment occurs, which it will, then we can go, oh, okay, I see what's happening. Now we can be awake to that and do something different. And as we spoke about yesterday in terms of attachment repair, ruptures and repair will happen, and they provide opportunities for new learning. So we're not supposed to be perfect therapists, right? We can be good enough, and that when mistakes happen, sometimes I kind of go, yay, like I did something, not that I want to injure my client, but I did something that, and then they told me, hey, I didn't like when you said that, or why did you look away in that moment, right, when I was telling you that, and that we can work with that and stay through it, because many of our clients did not have somebody stay through the process to repair. They would get defensive, they would jump into blaming, and so when we can stay receptive to that kind of feedback and say, thank you for telling me, let's take a look at that. Or like I was speaking about yesterday, that transparency of how important it is to be honest when we get distracted or when something was getting in the way with our attunement, because we're human. So sometimes I will refer to us as clinicians as the container for the emotions that the client cannot yet hold on their own. But we don't want to be a container so much that they leave the room and we're still holding it. Right? So you can also kind of, sometimes I imagine that there's a container that sits between myself and the client, and that they're kind of pouring their story in there, and we're looking in there together. And that when they leave, that we can kind of pour that out, and it can clear the slate and get ready for whoever's coming in next. As I've been having conversations and hearing questions from many of you, a lot of you work in agency, yeah? Like, show of hands. A lot of people. Anyone in the room in private practice? Okay, so there's quite a few as well. And so what I experienced, I worked in community mental health for about 5 years, and what I experienced there is that there isn't a whole lot of time in between, right? You're going very quickly session to session, and so that the self-care becomes harder, in part because you're not in as much control of your own schedule. And also, sometimes you're not in control of how many people you get to schedule throughout the day, and what you get exposed to, who comes in. You're not necessarily choosing which clients you're seeing. You get whatever intake comes in that day and so forth. And so to recognize that in those work settings, the self-care needs to be even more vigilant. And we'll go there as we go along. So in our psychodynamic base here, we're going to look at defenses, because these are really common. We don't necessarily analyze them in the same way that an analytic therapist might do, or an analyst might do. It's more to understand how the defenses show up to protect the client from the traumatic material. So for example, with repression, if I don't talk about it or acknowledge my painful past, it doesn't exist. Denial, yeah, I was abused, but it wasn't a big deal. Everyone had that, Avoidance, if I just stay in bed and sleep, then I don't have to face reality. And we see that a lot, the clients that, and some of that is also a dissociative layer. I have one man that I work with who says that if he does not make himself get out of the house, he will sleep in his armchair all day. Right? And it becomes a kind of a pseudo-safety. Right, to stay avoidant in a way, because then I don't have to face the unknowns out there, but it's not satisfying. Talk about a repeated pattern that ultimately feels extremely painful. Fantasy. If I act like everything will be okay, then it'll be okay. And self-blame / idealization. If only I hadn't been so bad, then I wouldn't have been abused. Right, so it's the blaming of the self. And we ultimately want to hold here that all of these defenses arise from trauma. They help us feel compassion for the client, and ultimately we can use that compassion to help soften the resistance. So I often share this story. This is a bit of a parable that I learned when I was a child. I was at a kind of storytelling event, and this story has stayed with me all of these years, and I love it for this resistance work. So if you imagine a man walking down the street with his coat and his scarf wrapped around him, and up above you've got the sun and the wind, and they're having a conversation. And the wind boastfully says to the sun, "I bet I can get that man to take off his coat and his scarf faster than you." And the sun says, "Okay, well, you're on." And so the wind blows and blows, and of course what happens, but the man holds on to his scarf and his jacket tighter. And the sun comes out and creates warmth, and very quickly the man takes off his scarf and jacket. And what this reminds us of is that if we fight against the resistance, if we fight against these defenses and make them wrong and try and blow them away, what's going to happen, right? They're going to get stronger. So if we come in and say, well, of course you learned to, to not talk about this and to try and pretend that it doesn't exist. Of course you want to stay in bed all day, and then what happens when you do that, right? And I tell you, I love those words, of course. There is something simply in that just communicates you're not doing anything wrong here, right? And even with the defenses that are in the self-harming category, right? As difficult as it is to have someone come in and say, "I cut last night," as we come forward and say, "Tell me about it. Oh my goodness, you must have been hurting so bad to want to do that," right? Do you want, and tell me what happened right before you cut, right? That we're building that rapport and that connection and the compassion right in there. And not that we want someone to keep doing that. We don't. I think sometimes the fear is, if I offer compassion, that somehow it's going to reinforce that they want to keep doing that. It actually doesn't work that way. It says, tell me about it, because how many times have people responded that way? No. What did you do to yourself? What's that? All of the time. People react in fear and in blame. And so to come forward and say, "Tell me about it. And oh my goodness, you must have been hurting. And I really want to help you so you don't feel like you have to hurt yourself again. And let's work as a team for that, all right? Because we're a collaborative team here." So our two kind of biggest defenses are projection and introjection. Projection is the process of attributing one's personal feelings or characteristics onto another person. For example, if there's a strong self-critic, I might believe that you see me self-critically. Or if there's a strong idealization or devaluation, it's usually a reflection of that split that exists within the self. Right? And often that projection is also layers of what got introjected about family of origin. So an introject is internalizing the beliefs of other people, so much so that they can't separate the other person's voice from themselves. And one of the best examples of this is the self-critic. Right? If there was a critical mother, a critical father, critical other in the family, then that can get internalized. And it's a form of control, right? If I take that over, then I can do that to myself, which means that I have a little bit more control in this situation. And, or taking over a feeling of unworthiness, incompetence. Identifying with the abuser is a form of taking over those qualities rather than having to feel helpless. And when we're working relationally, we are also going to work in that mutual regulation model. We spoke yesterday in preparation for this about co-regulation. And here we recognize that therapist and client are also mutually influencing each other. Remember how I said yesterday that research about how the mother's brain is changing, as much as the child's brain, or maybe not as much, but in addition to the child's brain? That we actually want to recognize that we are here to be changed by our clients. Right? If we don't let our clients impact us, we're blocking that gift that they have to give us, just like perhaps that gift was never received in the family of origin. And so, in a way, the most powerful therapeutic exchange is when we too allow ourselves to be moved by, to grow in response to the client. You guys have this experience? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, lots of nods in the room. It's really touching, and I think it speaks to the depth of the honor and the privilege that we have in doing this work. And I think it's also one of the scariest parts of this work, because sometimes we have clients that come in with rage. We have clients that come in with this most painful sadness, and to allow ourselves to be touched by that, to be moved by that, rather than staying wholly distant, is much more risky in a certain way. But it also is deeply satisfying mutually. That said, we don't want to lose our own regulation in the process. Otherwise, we're going to overly join the client in the dysregulated state, or like I said yesterday, everything's hopeless. Yeah, everything's hopeless, right? We don't want to get hypnotized into that as well. So we have to stay attuned to our own embodied awareness during sessions so that we can actually offer a modeling of regulation in ourselves. And that attunement of what's happening in your own body in the session might also provide insight into what might be happening in the inner world of the client. Right? So that as you're sensing and feeling the subtle changes throughout the time that you're sitting there together, you might, like I shared that example yesterday of all of a sudden feeling like my heart was racing. We want to pick up on those moments, or the moments where I felt like I was getting tired. And sometimes it's hard to know, is this mine, is this theirs? Right? And we'll speak a little bit more about that. But ultimately, again, to borrow from Bromberg, that ultimately our work is to receive the gift of the client. I'll give a little example here. This is a woman who described an event in which her parents were fighting about finances downstairs, and she was upstairs in the house listening to this, and she decided at the age of 5 that she was going to write up a budget. And so she walks downstairs and she hands Mommy and Daddy the budget that she's drawn for the family, and they laughed. And the laughter, on one hand, you might think, oh, sweet, they stopped fighting. No, that didn't happen either. They laughed. I don't know if they tore it up, but that was basically the feeling. And they continued on with their fighting. And she went back upstairs, utterly rejected. Right? And remember, we talked yesterday about shame and the thwarting of the positive emotion. utterly rejected, and this feeling of like she had worked so hard to create this and it wasn't received. And so a lot of the work together was really finding for the first time what it felt like to be received, and to allow that experience to be repaired, and even to say, my goodness, if I were your mom and you came down with that budget, here's how I would have responded. Thank you. You were so worried about this, and you took the time to make this, and the grief that came over her, and having that experience repaired of what could have happened, what should have happened, right? Not that it undoes what did happen, but it allows one to have another reference point. So looking at this from the angle of countertransference and somatic resonance, clients will evoke disowned emotions and relational expectations in the therapeutic relationship. And we will differentiate between objective countertransference and subjective countertransference. Objective countertransference is basically what the client is evoking in you that's about them, right? And it provides insight into their inner world. Subjective countertransference is when the client is evoking something in you and it's about you, right? And often it's a combination of the two. Most importantly, once you feel it, it's your responsibility to take care of what you're experiencing, whether it's ultimately in some way or another to give that back to them, in some way or another to go through and touch into whatever that has brought up from your own history. And along these lines, Stanley Kellerman, who's a somatic psychotherapist, he speaks about the concept of somatic resonance. And this is really the somatic reactions that can happen in us in response to the client. And again, it can happen in both the objective or the subjective countertransference, right? But you'll have anyone in the room have this experience where you'll experience something in your body either when you're in the room with the client or after they've left the session. I'm seeing lots of nods in the room, okay? And and if you haven't had that experience, there's nothing wrong with you. But what I would say is that the more awareness that you bring in of your own somatic experience, the more likely that you'll start to notice these things. And sometimes, and this is usually for me after like a first session with someone, that it's like almost like I get so much information that I am not able to process it at the time, that after the client leaves the room, I'll have certain things like whatever I observed, like how they were picking up their phone or how they were like gestures. I find myself like taking over some of those gestures, and it happens unconsciously, but it's a way in which we kind of process what it's like to be the other. And so to not be so afraid of that, but sometimes again, if we can offer our mindful practice to that after a session, it can help us metabolize the experience and integrate how that might be useful for a future session. I'll give an example of this. I was working with a gal who had experienced a lot of rejection in childhood and a lot of chaos, and we had worked together actually for a while, so it took me by surprise that when she left the room, I really felt this kind of residue of her kind of still lingering, and I just so happened to have my own supervision right afterwards. And so I went into supervision, and I created a kind of dialogue where I put the client in an empty chair, and I sat in my seat, and then I went and sat in the seat that I had put the client into, and kind of took over those mannerisms. There were certain facial expressions, certain gestures, certain kind of way that she was putting her gaze, and I could see it so clearly, so freshly, because I had just come from the session. And what was so striking when I took that over and really allowed myself to embody the client was how much information I had that I could immediately apply into the next session. And we'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about parts work, but what became really clear was that there was a part of the client that hadn't been acknowledged in the room. And so we had been working with I actually spoke a little bit about her yesterday, this memory of being an infant in the crib and how no one came for her. And so we've been working with that, but there was this other part that basically was interfering with the ability to be caring toward that young self. And this was the self that said, that basically about the age of 5 took over and said, oh, now I know that if I just am really funny and if I can perform and if I do all of these things, and that's how I can get attention. And that part kept kind of taking over in a way and interfering with the fact that there underneath that was this deep kind of void of hopelessness that was very, very hard to touch, very hard to get access to. And so, of course, you're going to basically kind of have this other part that's going to come in and say, look, I'm just going to use this strategy. This was good enough. And so once I was able to get in touch with that in my body and to go back in and say, you know what, this is what I think's happening. And this is someone I'd worked with for a while. I was really able to be really explicit about this. And it let us then get underneath that into the underlying hopelessness that was there and to really attend to that, which is what had been really ignored for so long, even in her own internal system. This is a very complex example, but are you guys following me? Yeah, okay. Any questions before? Yes, please.
As a new clinician, I just had maybe a naive question for a lot of folks here, but as far as self-disclosure, I was in clinicals last year, and I worked as a psych MP student, I worked with a psychiatrist, and after the patient left, and she said, boy, you disclosed too much information. And then the next person she was with, she was talking to him and telling him, I like broccoli, and blah, blah, blah. I'm thinking, wait a minute, she's telling him over like first I asked her after that. She said, I thought you said don't self-disclose. Well, I've known him for oh, okay, so I'm trying to self-disclosure process. And you had mentioned, what made me think about it, you had mentioned how you would react if you were a parent if they brought you the budget story.
Yeah.
So I just a quick view, what your thought of with your clients, how you approach, it's not necessarily self-disclosure, but you're putting yourself into that.
Yes.
What I would have done as a parent.
Great.
So, just a question on that.
Great. I'll answer some of it now, and some of it we'll kind of bring back as we go into parts work. But the question is about the use of self-disclosure, and I'll just say to you, as you're mentioning, you're a new clinician, and there's no dumb questions here. So every question is welcome. And self-disclosure, I do think, is very client-specific, and I do think it's very kind of phase of relationship specific in the sense of how well you know someone. But it's interesting. I tend, as you can probably tell just from getting to know me here in this last day, that I tend to use more self-disclosure than some, right? And that kind of theoretically there are different theoretical models that really value self-disclosure, particularly kind of feminist psychotherapy or psychology theories, emphasize more self-disclosure because there is, again, just more of a rapport, more of an evening of the playing field. It also fits with that biopsychosocial of, I'm not going to put myself up here and you down there. We're going to really hold ourselves as kind of mutual partners in healing. Not that I'm going to dismiss the education and the experience that I have. I actually want to use that in service of the client to offer that as a privilege that I have, as something that I can give. And for some clients, self-disclosure does not work, right? Because it feels like it's, hey, this is my time here. This is my hour. I'm paying you. I don't want to listen to you, right? And so, so to really listen to the cues verbally and non-verbally, that sometimes I'll do a little test of self-disclosure and I'll watch them go like, oh, when is she going to be done? Oh, that's it. Usually doesn't go that far, but if it does. And usually they're very short pieces, I usually ask their permission. Is it okay with you if I share with you a little story that your experience touches off in me? And usually they say yes, please. They actually welcome it. And I keep it very short, and they're well-chosen snippets that are in service of their process, either for the purpose of building empathy, like it's not so much the broccoli, but but it's more, like that moment of I have a sense that I might know what it feels like in that moment, right? And it's not so much so that they feel like they're then taking care of me. And I make that very explicit. This is not for you to take care of me. In fact, I've gotten a chance to work on this in my own therapy. So, this is just that sense of like we're all here in this kind of human experience. So hopefully that answers your question. Thank you. So going back to relational reenactments, that clients will recreate these relationship patterns that match what they know. Our job as therapists is to know our own attachment history, right? So that we are not unconsciously reenacting our attachment style in the room. This requires that we use some of our own mindful reflection, allowing us to, again, differentiate between the subjective and objective countertransference. And I'll give an example here. This is two things. One is that before a session, it is very helpful to do a brief body scan. Even if you only have 30 seconds between sessions, or you need to do this on your quick run to the restroom, right? But to do a brief body scan, and I think of this as a little bit of a chance to let go of anything from the previous session, check in with what you are aware of in your body and your mind, that 5-point check-in: body, mind, breath, energy, emotions, right? And you check in with what you're aware of, and then as you're sitting down with the next client, be the observer and notice if your experience changes, right? And it might be right away, it might be 15 minutes into session, it might be toward the end. And so that you have a sense of that baseline of where you're starting out the day, and then what maybe gets touched off in that working together. And I can't really show it here. Maybe someday I'll add it to my slides, but I usually have lined down the page that I keep notes on. So I keep a notepad, and I'm keeping notes throughout a session because it allows me to track what's happening during the session. But I keep a line about 3/4 of the way down the page, and on the right side of that line, I write down what gets evoked in me. And I use that information. This was something that I learned to do when I was in grad school. It's warm in here today. Is anyone else feeling warm? Okay, yeah. Okay. What kind? Thank you. I'm warm. So I write down the things that I notice in me, and sometimes I write it down as a question mark of like, I wonder if this is something that I want to bring back forward during the session. Sometimes I write it down as like I make a little star and say, bring this to supervision. This one's yours, Arielle, right? And but it lets me keep track of that, and it lets me be aware of what happens over time, so that maybe I look back and 3 sessions in a row, I notice, wow, I got this real tightness in my throat with the same person 3 weeks in a row. That's really interesting. I want to be really curious about that. Right? So I might notice some of those somatic countertransference pieces. Sometimes when I notice a pattern like that, where I'm sitting with someone and I'll get a lot of tightness in my chest and my throat, if I have the rapport with the client, I might use that information and just say something like, either, I'm really curious what you're noticing in your body, just to see if we can anchor just a basic body awareness, or could you bring your awareness into your throat right now and just see what you're aware of? And sometimes I might even disclose why I'm asking the question, because they might look at me like, how'd you know? Or, which actually happens a lot, that's kind of amazing, because if I'm feeling something here and I'm noticing a pattern of it and I mention that and they're like, oh my gosh, I've got so much tension in my throat, it's like there's a lump there. Okay, go ahead and breathe with that, because there's that resonance that's happening in the space. And if it feels a little strange just to go right for that place in the body, I might just say, you know what, I'm noticing that I'm starting to feel a lot of tension in my throat, and I'm just curious. I don't know if that has to do with you or not, but why don't you take a few breaths and see what you're noticing in your body? So different ways to go about asking that question. And of course, we're working with rupture and repair, as I mentioned. So the mindful therapist provides a safe space to help the clients reflect on emotions and patterns, and ultimately to own the disowned parts of self. Because what's getting played out there is often a reflection of what's getting played inside that can't be consciously held. Right? So I'll give an example. This is a woman who is very, very highly self-critical, and also would come in very critical of me, and just kind of wanted to rip me apart every session. And so, sitting there and I'm working with it, and I could just feel like how much I wanted to protect myself and prepare myself before she would come into session. Oh, that's that session where I'm going to get attacked. And it's so painful when that happens. And I finally had to speak to what was happening in the room and just say, sometimes I feel like you're going to kind of be so critical of me, and it's hard to stay present with you. And I really want to care for you, and I really want to do good work together. But I notice myself getting defensive, very transparent, right? And she softened and she said, I do to you what I do to myself. Oh, right? Then it didn't totally stop, right? But what it did do is it gave us a platform. And I said, can I ask your permission? Okay. Can I let you know when that starts to happen? Rather than just riding through it, muscling through it, trying to be okay through it, can I stop us when that starts to happen, and can we explore what's happening? Can we go a little deeper with that? So as soon as that thing of, you don't do everything right, it's always on your schedule, Dr. Schwartz, I want to see you 5 days a week. I mean, she really did. She kind of wanted to move into the office. And so that feeling of I could never do enough. And so when we could highlight those moments and say, what's happening right there? In me, it feels like I can never do enough. And she said, that's how I feel all the time. It created this consistent way to deepen in. And where does that come from in you? Well, that was my entire experience growing up. So it launches us into the deeper work. And of course, at that moment, I feel like, oh my gosh. And not that ultimately her rage didn't need to be welcomed in the room, because underneath that was deep rage for being criticized for so many years and put down and not treated kindly within her family. But the rage was displaced onto me, and it was displaced onto her. And so when we could unwind that pattern, and I could say, your anger about this is welcome here. And I can see how it's scary, because sometimes it scares me too. Right? And let's work with that in another way, where we could kind of make space for the rage without it having to land on either of us. That's when the whole system unlocked, and it doesn't happen anymore. I still work with her. She does not come in with that attack anymore. And she's become much softer with herself. Yes, please.
It reminds me of patients that we call patients, because it's a health clinic that I work with, and I was wondering, how do you work with patients that all of a sudden take out like a notebook and starts writing a session?
As a way for them to keep notes on the session? So the question is, how working with someone who comes in and takes out a notebook and starts writing during the session. I guess I'd be really curious about it. I have some clients that do that, and it's a way for them to keep track. I have one fellow that comes in and asks my permission to record every session, which then gives him a chance to not have to write, but actually be able to go back and listen later, and I really appreciate that. Sometimes it does keep me a little bit more aware. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm on tape here, but and that's not a bad thing. So I would be really curious, what is it that you're writing down, and does it help? Right? Does it allow you to deepen your process? Or for this person, the way you're asking the question, is it distancing? Is it separating you from the feelings? And how can we kind of include the urge to want to write in a way that becomes helpful, but maybe not so much in service of the defense, or if it is in service of the defense, really honor what purpose it's serving consciously? Does that help? Okay. Yeah. So this, kind of takes us into this realm of working with attachment in therapy, right? And so what we know about caregiver and therapist behaviors that foster secure attachment is that we want to be predictable and attuned and consistent and congruent, which goes back to transparency, and trustworthy, reflective, and just good enough. Right? That secure attachment, which is ultimately what we want to foster in the therapeutic relationship, is regulating of affect and arousal. It promotes expression of feelings and communication. I'm not going to read all of this, it's in your notes, but I think it's rather familiar for us in the room. Right? Provides that secure base for exploration. And that there are also the attachment wounds that our clients are bringing into the room, whether it's through the experience of invasion, intrusion, or abuse, abandonment or neglect, or a combination of these. And what we'll say here is that often that abandonment or neglect is kind of facilitates, abandonment can facilitate a feeling of anxiety. Can also, if we are being consistently dismissed in our childhood experience, I'm just going to take this right into the next slide, that can lead to an insecure avoidant attachment where there's been distance or a disengaged caregiver, and this individual adapts by avoiding closeness. And what can happen, and what I think is important about pausing on this slide, is that the insecure avoidant attachment, even though they long for a deeper emotional connection, can feel extremely threatened by that, right? And so our attunement to the avoidant client might in itself actually be too much, right? It can actually, so we want to be kind of wise to know that sometimes emotionally tracking or attuning to a client can feel invasive, right? Just like if we look at that dance between someone who's avoidant and someone who's more ambivalent, and the more that they're trying to seek closeness and proximity, the more that the person who's avoidant wants to run away, right? You see this in relationships all the time. So we want to be wise, even at the use of our own eye contact, the use of our contact statements, to really be attuned to the level of contact that this person is capable of staying within the room. And then the anxious ambivalent person, this is the result of being raised by an inconsistent primary caregiver who at times was maybe highly responsive, perceptive, but it could also be intrusive or invasive. And in this case, there's a lack of predictability, and there's a underlying feeling of uncertainty and anxiety. And the insecure, ambivalent adult tends to feel overly dependent, right? It tends to have more abandonment anxiety and an overall sense that relationships are unreliable. And in this case, often what can happen in the room is that these clients don't want to let us go. Right? And they don't want to end the session on time. They want to contact us more between sessions. The avoidance clients we tend to not hear from between sessions, and in fact they might kind of go out there and be an island unto themselves out in the world when they really do need to reach out, whereas the ambivalent person might be reaching out and not know that they can really take care of their own needs between sessions. And the disorganized attachment, which of course can show up with complex PTSD, is this child has grown up with a parent whose behavior was a source of alarm and chaos and was abusive. And this sets up that fright without solution, the unsolvable dilemma, the paradox between the biological drive to seek closeness from a source of terror that they are also biologically driven to try and escape. Yeah. And so there are often much more of an impulsive, aggressive behaviors when intolerable emotions arise, and the relationship interactions can mimic what they themselves experienced. Yeah. So attachment style, oh, did I not move that before? Sorry. Here we go. So the attachment style or strategy. Attachment is, I don't think of attachment as so much a fixed style. I do think that we are, that we have predominant strategies, and that we also can rely on different strategies in different relationships, right? So an attachment strategy has helped the child to survive, and we can also modify a strategy to meet the needs of an adult. All right? And I think that this is important because a lot of the language out there about attachment speaks about it in a very fixed form. You have this attachment style, you're kind of, doomed to repeat. And when we see it as a strategy and we recognize that, again, if we look at this from a neuroplasticity perspective, that we can adapt and change that strategy to meet our needs now. That current relationships, again, can evoke different strategies at different times. So, for example, if there is a feeling of kind of both wanting, not wanting to experience abandonment and someone leaves and there is that kind of franticness, but then there's another friend and that friend really is kind of clingy and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be too close to you, right? And so there can be both responses in different relationships. And, the goal here is that we want to learn the behaviors that foster secure attachment, and we call this earned secure attachment, right? And that is a huge part of what we're doing in our therapy, is to help clients develop earned or learned secure attachment. We also recognize that we as therapists come into the relationship with our own attachment strategies, right? That we might be at sometimes the secure attachment, the secure therapist, right? We're centered, we're mindfully aware of our emotions, our sensations, our thoughts. And then in other times we might take over more of an avoidant therapist strategy, where we're focusing on the client's thoughts rather than their feelings. We might become more distant or even suddenly become more dismissive of their experience, right? We might inadvertently push the client away. And some of that might be, again, pulling on your own historical experience. Some of it might be pulling on what the client knows and is evoking in you. Right? And we might also become the anxious therapist, right? We're over-identifying or merging with the client. We may have difficulty setting boundaries. We might attempt to rescue the client. Okay? Or there are certain clients that we work with that might evoke the disorganized therapist in you. Right? In this case, you become anxious, unsettled, angry, or uncomfortable, either prior to seeing the person, during the session, or after the session. Okay? Then you might start to feel feelings of aggression toward the client, or you might feel victimized by the client. So the example that I gave before was exactly that. Right? And that our different clients are going to pull upon these different attachment strategies. So know thyself, right? Know your own attachment history, your own kind of predisposition toward any of these strategies, and also to know that when you're getting pulled into these different strategies, they might be indicative of of something that's happening with the client. So we're going to do a little experiential exercise with this, which is an opportunity to work with some countertransference for yourself, okay? And so I'd like you to take a moment. You can put down your notes if you'd like. You can go within and do a little self-reflection. And take a moment and reflect on a client that you might be working with currently, or maybe someone that you've worked with historically, that evokes some feelings for you, whether it's the pull to want to rescue them, whether it's the pull to want to distance from them. Maybe it's someone that brings up some feelings of fear before you see them, or leaves you feeling quite exhausted when they leave. And take a moment to imagine yourself sitting with this individual. Become aware of the feelings, the emotions, and somatic experience as you imagine yourself sitting with this client. Notice your posture. Notice how much space you take up when you're in the room with this person. Imagine how you speak with this client and the quality of your voice tone. What are you aware of in regards to your use of eye contact? And again, you can scan your body and notice any sensations that you're aware of. Let yourself stay curious about the process. And as you notice the kinds of thoughts that you're having, just be aware if there's any judgments that you have about yourself. Or perhaps you notice if there's any judgments about your client. Taking a moment to notice if you're blaming your client for your discomfort. And if so, explore what it would be like to take responsibility for your own experience, thoughts, emotions, and sensations. As you do so, ask yourself, is there anything familiar that connects to any other area of your life? Are there personal memories or experiences that relate to what it's like for you to sit with this client? And now, being aware of your body once again, notice if there's any sensations. Engage your breath and body awareness to stay present. If you do notice any part of your body that feels discomfort, see if you find any movements, again, that respond and regulate any movements. Maybe you place your hand over that part of your body. Maybe you change your posture, how you're breathing. Explore how you can re-engage your own social nervous system. You can press your feet into the floor, sense your fingers and toes. Maybe you rock gently from side to side. See if you can stay with your own embodied experience until you've achieved increased comfort with any previously uncomfortable sensations. Here you know that you're successful when you feel more present with yourself, and if you imagine the client in front of you once again, you notice that there's more space. Once again, as you imagine the client sitting in front of you, check in with your thoughts, emotions, your breath, your sensations. How do you feel toward this client now? How do you feel toward yourself? What would you like to believe about yourself as you imagine this client right now? What would you like to believe about your client? So just taking another moment here, reflect on your experience, your process, if there's anything you want to write down. Maybe you notice any new awareness that you'd like to bring into a future session. Anyone want to share anything about what that was like? No. Were you able to connect to any insight? Go ahead. It was tiring. Yeah. Do you feel like the tired feeling is connected directly to that individual, or what gets evoked in you with that person?
What gets evoked, it's parental situation, like dealing with kids plus parents and a lot of things. It can be really frustrating because there's a lot of barriers that just can't be navigated.
Yeah.
Therapy plus working in crisis.
Very complex, very complex. I'm going to repeat that for people listening from home. You're speaking about working with parents and kids in a very complex system. And, you in a way made this very, very real, because sometimes it's not just one individual that we're trying to track and get information about. It's a whole system. It's a whole system with barriers that you can't navigate, and that feeling of this is tiring is very accurate. Yeah.
Tiring and defeating.
And defeating,
You feel like
yes.
you want to help, you know what would help.
Right.
But they're not engaging, and the
Yeah.
system doesn't work as well as it should. So
Right.
I'm just kind of throwing it in. It's like,
Yeah, that feeling of just, you got to throw your hands up in the air, there's nothing you can do, because you're up against a whole system here. And if the family is not doing their own work, and this is true for individual clients as well, if the client themselves is not invested in doing the work, if you're saying, hey, let's be partners in your health care, and the client's like, nah, you just do it for me, right? Yeah, that's tiring. That's tiring. And I think unless we acknowledge that there are limitations in these situations, then we are at risk of burning out, right? Like, it's like you're going to keep running into the room with the budget. They'll be like, yeah, well, we don't want that budget. Well, oh my gosh, right? Like, your gift is really not going to be received, and hopefully that's not the par for the course. Hopefully there are other families that you work with where there's more efficacy or more kids that are more receptive, because I think that we need to feel that what we're bringing to the work actually is received. Yeah, yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
About a client who was had borderline and was very critical, like the person you spoke of earlier, and experienced, I was thinking of a specific experience where it was kind of like an attack on something I was saying, even though I didn't realize it. And I remember the emotion that flooded, which was like defensiveness.
Yeah.
I didn't express it, but the internal defensiveness and emotions that just flooded me.
Yes.
Clouded my mind, and I knew at the time, I'm like, okay, you're totally overwhelmed, you're trying to keep a good face on, so you're not showing that to the person.
Yeah.
And I realized that it's back to, now it's me. How am I going to recover from that and do what's right for that person?
Yeah.
They're the one that needs the help. And
Yeah.
how do I take me out of the equation, which is you can't separate your emotions from yourself. So it's really difficult. And
Yeah.
was that talking about the amygdala and the fear response and that connection yesterday about the time frame of your executive thinking and your amygdala? That's what.
Yes.
How do I recover from that in a quicker process?
Great. I want to repeat that for people listening from afar. So the description is working with a borderline client who, in some way or another, kind of was critical or attacking, kind of similar to the example that I gave, and that feeling of defensiveness that came over you, and oh my goodness, how do I not enact that out, and how do I then regulate and take care of myself in that moment so that it doesn't replay. And it is hard to catch sometimes. I mean, sometimes the defensiveness does come out, and that's the rupture and repair process, right? And but I do think that that is really a huge part of everything we're talking about here is when you feel that defensiveness rise up, you feel that your amygdala has gotten hot, right, and your heart rate. And has anyone in the room not felt that? I mean, right, like no hand's going to go up, right? We all know that moment, and it is it's intense, and it is the exact reenactment that we're talking about, but when it comes out at us, it is so incredibly painful and scary, and can touch up that, just that immediate, I want to run. Like, I've gone into fight flight, and I can't fight my client, and I can't run out of the room, right? And so to regulate, but I think ultimately we need to name, like, wow, that, I'm noticing myself feeling defensive, and I don't want to take it out on you, but I fell under attack. Like, that there's got to be some way to hold it and to say, I'm so curious. What's happening for you right now? And some clients will not let go of that. I mean, that hook or that need to attack you, the therapist. And sometimes what I say in my own mind is, boy, they're really going after Arielle. Like, I just kind of let the clone take the hit, because I know that it's a projection. And I have to really hold that if there's no way in, and I might even say, you are so angry at Arielle right now. Like, I'll use myself in the third person for a moment. She can't do anything right. Now, sometimes that makes the whole thing worse, in which case I'll say, you're so angry at me right now. It's okay to be angry at me, because you've never had anyone that could receive your anger, have you? And that is probably the most diffusing statement that I could offer in that room, is, boy, you really needed to be angry, and I think you probably felt safest to finally express that with me. I know that you had a question. There's a few more coming up.
Yeah, what came to my mind was 3 suicidal patients. One of them is actively suicidal and has made several attempts. Another who keeps wishing he could die because his wife died a while back. But he said, I will not commit suicide. And the third is from a family of people where there have been many suicides, extremely anxious, and just dropped off my calendar. And I can't go anywhere with my own reaction to that except just prompt concern.
Thank you. So the statement here is about working with suicidal clients, and the evoked experience is one of chronic concern, because, and I do think that, boy, if there is like an evoked countertransference, suicide is a biggie, all right? And it requires so much breath and so much. I mean, when we ask that question of what is it that you wish you could believe about yourself when you imagine sitting with the client or these suicidal clients, what is it that you want to be able to say to yourself?
I could find a way to convince them to change their mind.
I'd like to convince them to change their mind. And sometimes the best we can do is, I'm doing the best I can. And I have to really trust that I'm doing the best that I can. And boy, wouldn't we all like to be able to change someone else's mind? I hear that. And I think that's what's so painful about it, is if we can think about it another way, how come you can't think about it another way? I can see the possibility. Yeah. What I do know, in experience of working with suicidal clients, is that the more space that we give to the conversation around suicide, the less isolated the person feels with those thoughts and feelings. And it is such a relief to be able to talk about it somewhere. That I think the more that we get comfortable having those conversations with clients rather than going into our own reaction, it sounds like you really do have that strength, that ability to have these conversations with people. That is a tremendous strength, and to know that is a service in itself. Yeah. Yes?
What do you do when you bring up what's coming up for you in session and the client immediately starts apologizing?
So if you bring up something personal for you and then the client starts to apologize because they feel responsible for your experience, I would just make that really explicit. You are not responsible for my experience right now. I share it with you because I'm hoping it's information for what's happening in the room, but not for you to take responsibility for it. This one's mine. And I also use that as information, like, okay, that this might not be the person that I would use as much self-disclosure with because it would evoke that kind of countertransference for them, or transference for them. Yeah. Did you have one?
Well, we all have those people, and I had one go off in my face just last week, and I found it funny that I was actually thinking, Christ, I'm always looking for a freaking exit with that one young man. And I started to put my boots on because I was going to get out of this room. I remember that my counselor once said to me, because when I was working with middle school kids, sometimes I would get this powerful response. And he said, if you're getting that, it's because you're getting through. On some level, you're getting through. And the second thing is, maybe I'm one of the few safe people this person ever had.
Yes.
I'm not going to smack them.
Right.
I will call security,
Ah.
but I'm not going to smack them, not going to hit them, and I'm not going to shame them.
Great. I want to repeat what you're saying before you share more, just because otherwise I won't get it all. So one was that you were speaking about a client who got up in your face and was attacking, and that urge to exit, and then you noticed you were putting your shoes on. That made me laugh. And like right here in this room, like, I'm out of here. And that the second statement, which is really touching, is to really say to yourself, maybe I'm one of the safest people that this person has ever had. And that because I'm not going to hit them, I'm not going to yell at them, I might still call security to keep myself safe, but I'm not going to attack back. And I think that is such a huge statement right there. This might be one of those few moments of safety that this person's had. I want to move us forward with the material, but we might come back to this. Does that feel okay? Was there anything that I missed here in the room? Okay. So, and just to orient you in terms of when a break is coming, we are going to go until about 9:45, and then we'll take a break, okay? So we're going to talk more about ego states and parts work. This is really one of my most favorite topics. And I'm curious, with a quick show of hands, who already would you describe as parts work in the room? I might have asked this yesterday, but I don't remember. Okay, about a handful of you, about 6 or so. Okay. So one of my hopes is that you will all walk away, even if you're not totally ready to go out there and do parts work, that you will all get a buy-in as to why parts work is so important. Okay, because I truly believe that it is one of the, like, if there's a kind of like a tripod to a stool, and I know that my EMDR therapy, although I can't make this a tripod, it's got to be like a 6-legged stool, right? But like, I've got my relational work, and I really love my EMDR work, and I love my somatic work. I couldn't do this work without parts work. Okay, and because with complex PTSD, there's a very complex inner system often, and especially with dissociation, to know what's happening in that internal system is just essential. So we'll talk about a few different models of parts work. The first is ego state therapy, and here just a very simplistic but valuable model of understanding that there is often a child or different ages of child parts of the client, that there are internalized parents that can be critical, abusive, permissive, neglectful. Right? And that in ego state therapy, we are recognizing the disowned parts of self, and we're giving these parts a voice. And so, anyone in here do any Gestalt work? Okay, a few people in the room. So, or voice dialogue, anyone familiar with that? So they're all very connected, but basically when we're working with parts, a very simple way of doing that is trying to understand what has been introjected, right, that internalized parent, and to be able to unblend the sense of self, to differentiate a sense of self from whoever has been introjected, right? And so if it's a very strong self-critic and the identity of the client is totally blended with that self-critic, I am a bad person, I'm unworthy, I'm good for nothing. Everything I try, it falls apart. They're completely blended with that part. Who told you? Who was so, you're pretty mean to yourself sometimes, huh? Yeah. How does it feel when you're so mean to yourself? It's all I know, right? Is there any part of you that feels like this just, like you want to be done with all of the self-attack? And we'll start to listen for because clients will actually start to use parts language on their own. Well, there's part of me that just feels like I'm a piece of crap, and there's part of me that feels like, well, maybe life is worth living, right? Going back to, there's part of me that wants to die, and there's part of me that knows that, that I don't want to do that. So now let's take a look. So the part of you that wants to die, what messages does that part tell you? Well, it tells me I'm worthless, that it's hopeless, that I've got nothing to live for, that I'm not, that I've got nothing worth giving to this world. How long have you felt that way? My whole life? That's what I was told when I was growing up. Who told you that? My dad? How did he tell you? Oh, he would tell me that I was, that I was worthless, that I shouldn't have been born. What do you wish you could tell your dad? So we're starting to unblend the part, right? If we were to put your dad in an empty chair, it's simple, but if we were putting your dad in an empty chair, what do you wish that you could tell him now? Stop being so mean to me. Shut up. Get off my back, right? And you can even then have them switch seats. Go be your dad for a minute. Take over that voice, right? And then they can take over that critic. Now go back and be in the other seat. What does it feel like to be receiving that? It feels horrible. Yeah. I bet that felt horrible your whole life, didn't it? Yeah. Did you ever really stand up to him? No, I never really could. How does it feel to do that now? Right? So you're giving a new experience, hopefully. So, another model of parts work is internal family systems. And here there is an exile that carries the burdens of the trauma, including emotions and memories. And Richard Schwartz, no relative of mine, he talks about how we have managers and firefighters, right? These are kind of different categories of parts. The managers tend to control the exile through excessive, control again, but working hard, being very critical, perfectionism, right? Like I'm going to keep this part in line, right? And again, you can sense that there's introject there, right? And the firefighters try and prevent the exile from coming up to consciousness or to emerging by acting out. So this is where addictions might come in, or self-harming behaviors, self-attack. And ultimately, the goal of this work is to help the client connect to the self. Here, the self is a confident and compassionate core of the individual and really a source of wisdom. So there's a lot of mindfulness used in IFS work to help the client be able to, again, be differentiated from those parts and to be able to have compassion for the exile. Also to be able to unblend from the internalization that's feeding the firefighters or the managers, right? So this system here, do you guys see how this fits with some of the people that you work with? Can you see how this might play out? Yeah. And the model that I use a lot in my own conceptual, kind of case conceptualization, my own reflection and thinking about my complex clients is the structural dissociation model. And here I spoke about this briefly yesterday, that there is an apparently normal part, right? This is the part that goes out into the world, that clients can go to work or can go to the store or kind of show up out in the world, maybe walk into your office with this apparently normal part that is going through the daily tasks, not talks, and feels disconnected or as if they're going through motions. And then there are also defenses that try and keep that emotional part out of our awareness, right? So this is perfectionism or control or idealization, intellectualization, addictions, and then of course there's emotional parts that are connected to the traumatic memories. And the reason why there's a beach ball up here is this is a metaphor that I actually will often share with clients because it just makes so much sense. They really get it. And so if you imagine that there is the unwanted emotional experience connected to trauma, and that they're working so hard that it's like they're pushing a beach ball under the water, right? And that you can only kind of keep that beach ball under the water with effort. Right? You have to actively remember you're holding it down there, you're using your muscles to push, but at some point, inevitably, you're going to get tired or you're going to get distracted, or maybe you're going to drink too much, or maybe you're going to get in a fight and get triggered by your spouse, right? And at some point, that beach ball is going to come flying out of the water and it's going to make a big splash. It's going to make a big mess. Right? That the goal of our trauma work is to allow that beach ball to slowly come up to the surface so that by the time it gets there, it can just arrive. Right? And it no longer needs to make that big splash. And it's a way of getting a buy-in to why we need to work with that exiled or emotional part. Right? Or why we need to, again, talk about or start to work with the feelings associated with the childhood abuse, right? So that we're not pushing that down and avoiding it and pretending it didn't happen, and then your kid does something and the next thing you know you're yelling and screaming at your kid, right? So that you can know what can evoke those feelings and allow that to come to your own consciousness through the mindfulness, through the compassion. Say, oh, that touches off in me those painful feelings of what it was like when I felt so out of control, when I felt so helpless. And I can hold in my own consciousness that part of me that has those feelings, right? And I think that's where that mindful gap comes in between the trigger and the reactivity, is that we can hold a part of self and say, oh, that part always felt so put down. And then my kid's getting in my face and they're yelling at me, and all of a sudden I'm that kid that never got to yell at my dad. Right? But I'm yelling at my kid, and that's the wrong place. I don't want to do that. Right? But I can get in touch with the part of me and that wishes that he could have talked back to my dad and say, get out of my face, stop yelling at me. Right? So when we're doing parts work, we are assessing and treating for dissociation. We're looking for those subtle signs and for those overt symptoms. And we're looking for the cues of parts, right? The self-critic, the self-harm. We're looking for the body symptoms that might be cues of parts. And sometimes it can show up as pain, right? Headache, nausea, dizziness. Sometimes it can show up in a change in voice tone, right? All of a sudden you're sitting with someone and then they start talking really little, right? You can get really curious about that kind of change in voice tone so that we're listening for a state shift. A change in body posture, a change in how they're using eye contact. They start looking away. Even some of those repetitive movements in the body, when I spoke about the head turning, but also some of these other repetitive movements can be an indication that there's a part that's in the room. Changes in breathing pattern or holding the breath. Yeah. So I want to give another example here, because sometimes there are multiple exiles or multiple emotional parts. That's a more complex version of that structural dissociation slide. So this is an example of a young woman. She came into my office at the age of 23, and she had been experiencing, since the age of 5, severe fainting spells. She would faint, she would lose bowel control, and she would wake up in a big mess. And she would, prior to the fainting, have kind of severe gastric distress. People thought it maybe was IBS. It was really none of this was ever really clearly diagnosed. She had been to multiple doctors, and no one was really able to get at the root of this. So for 17 years, she's been having these periodic fainting spells. And she, as we were working together, we were taking a kind of history. There wasn't a whole lot that she remembered about her early childhood, except that her dad was an alcoholic, and that her mom was a nurse, and that her mom was most present for her when she was sick. But of course, she was sick a lot as a child, right? And that she also described that about the age of 12, she started to drink and to do drugs and to be very promiscuous and be out of the house a lot. And she got in a lot of trouble for that for many years. And she was now sober at 23, which was a personal life choice, but also struggling kind of painfully with this lingering somatic symptom that was interfering with her ability to be a functioning adult and go out and try and live her life. And so as we were working with the experience, because she would often come into session or in the middle of session start to feel nauseous, so we were starting to do some parts work with the nausea, and she got in touch that the nausea felt connected to being very little. And so she kind of said, well, about 5, because that's when this started. That's when I started having these spells. And so we had her put her 5-year-old in the chair, and which actually was the chair she'd been sitting in. She was so identified with this 5-year-old and that nausea that she was feeling. And I had her get out of the chair, and I had her go sit on a couch looking across at the 5-year-old self. And she sat there and she started to cry. And I said, what are you noticing? And she said, Arielle, this is the first time that I felt 23. Really? She said, yeah, I didn't even know I've been living as a 5-year-old. That's how I feel all the time. And she came over and she said, I'm like, I have this sense of myself as an adult young woman, looking at the 5-year-old self. So we got this sense of self in the room. And it was so powerful, and we really stayed with that. She had a lot of compassion for her 5-year-old self. That wasn't a problem. And so she, kind of had some dialogue work, and we ended that session. And she came back next week, and she said, I want to do that again. That was so powerful. So she says, okay, I want to put my 5-year-old self in the chair. And so she's sitting across, and she looks at me, and she goes, I need another chair in here. And I said, okay. So she's into this now. And she said, well, I need my 12-year-old self here. I said, okay. So she puts another chair in the room for her 12-year-old self. And I said, do you want to go sit in that chair? And she said, yeah. And so she goes and she sits in the chair of the 12-year-old self. And just mind you, I want to say that this was about maybe 4 months into our work together. By this time, we had been working in window of tolerance. I just want to back up this part of the story for a moment. We've been working with window of tolerance. We've been tracking how she could notice in her body the symptoms that she would have before the fainting, right? So she actually had already stopped the fainting by this point. They were happening about once every other week prior to that, and now she had gone for about 3 months without fainting, simply through window of tolerance work. She was able to recognize, oh, I can catch it before I go into the full-on faint by engaging greater self-care earlier on. So that was pretty huge. Anyhow, going back to this session, she puts into an empty chair her 12-year-old self, and she goes and she sits into that seat. And her head is down, her shoulders are hunched, and she sits there silently for quite a long time. And finally she peeks up from that place and she says, I have the secret. I'll say that again. I'm holding the secret. Her 12-year-old self says that when she was 5, she had been sexually abused by her uncle. And that she had tried to tell her mom really didn't want to hear it, and so didn't really listen. And that went underground. And that had been what was behind all of the somatization for all of these years. At that point, she went back, she had a relationship with her mom, and she told her mom what happened, who at this point then listened. Very, very powerful example of parts work, right? That, one of the things that we want to hold when we're doing this work is that when we don't have to know where this is going, right? I had absolutely no idea where this was going. All right. And it wasn't so much that this was a quote-unquote recovered memory, because she was very clear and had very clear memories about it once she got in touch with that place. But she had disconnected from it, derealized that place so strongly because it was way too threatening for her whole family system to realize it, that she joined with that family system to not realize it herself. Yeah. Please.
I think it's really important to point out that parts work has nothing to do with DID.
Uh-huh.
When you're separating the parts and individuals come out with their parts and their different selves, it's not DID.
Yes.
I think it's important to do that for people who don't do parts work and hear that, someone's coming out with different parts of themselves.
Yeah.
It's not DID. It's not them living different personalities.
Exactly. I'm going to repeat that for people that are watching from afar. So the statement is that it's important to recognize that parts work isn't necessarily DID, right? Sometimes it is, but it is not necessarily, and in this case it was not, right? And so, because I think that it can feel scary for people who live somewhere on that dissociative continuum, because she really did have some DDNOS, dissociative disorder not otherwise specified, right? Like there was some dissociation that was absolutely clearly reflected in her symptomology. Because the nausea and the fainting, if we go back to yesterday's continuum, there's no question that she was going into a vasovagal syncope, right? That she was having a literal faint response that was not medically explained. And but this was not a full-on DID. She was not state switching. She was not part switching. She was not going through periods of time. She had poor memory of her childhood. That's not that uncommon. But you can do parts work with anyone, because guess what? You all have parts. I have parts. Woohoo! Like, it's normal, right? And I think that, and I like parts work. I think it's a really powerful way in to getting to know oneself and to recognizing, look, whether you like it or not, we all have inner child, whatever age we are. And I think that when we can compassionately turn toward, and it doesn't mean that we have to solidify a part either. Right? That there's a way in which I want to be compassionate toward different emotions and different sensations and parts of myself in a way that doesn't have to make them solid. Like my 5-year-old is always going to feel this way, right? Because then we're in some way or another reinforcing a split that we don't want to reinforce. But we want to honor the ability to work with different aspects of self and to see that there's also a whole that can hold all of that.
I was going to ask a question about working with law enforcement that may have trauma from their occupation. Would that be considered parts work where they're compartmentalizing their law enforcement trauma and kind of almost isolating in that environment, that culture?
Mm-hmm.
Because they can't separate their job from who they are. They can't be open and vulnerable when they go to a psychologist for help maybe.
I don't know that I would necessarily consider that parts work. The question is when you're working with someone in law enforcement that has to, first responders, law enforcement, military, where there is a very strong culture that is different from the culture that they go to at home. And so that feeling of compartmentalizing of who I get to be in one environment, it is in a certain way parts work, but I don't know that I would treat it the same way. Yeah. Unless there really is a kind of interfering element to that compartmentalization that needs to be addressed or needs to be held in another way, or if it's touching off something younger. But ultimately, the goal of parts work therapy is to strengthen the adult self so that that can be a resource and a container for the young parts and associated emotions. We want to be able to unblend or achieve differentiation between the adult self and subparts, and we can do that by having dialogue with parts. We want to identify sabotaging parts that are interfering with therapy. Sometimes there is a part that really doesn't want therapy to work, and we can put that part in the chair. Can you understand why this part of you doesn't want you to get better? Right? Maybe I don't want to lose the support of you as my therapist. Right? Maybe I don't want to lose the dependency that I have on my partner if I get better. Maybe I don't want to lose my disability SSDI, right? There can be kind of different elements to that are speaking to the fear that keeping parts separate. And when we're working with parts, we want to identify the function of the part. We want to understand whether this is managing or controlling the intolerable emotion, if it's sabotaging, if it's an exile, and we want to identify the need of the part. So one of the goals of therapy here is, can you identify if this is a need for greater protection, if it's a need for boundaries, if it's a need for nurturance or wisdom? And as you deepen awareness of a part, I'll offer a few kind of guiding principles here. One is that you can ask the client, how is this feeling familiar? Right? Are you aware of memories that are connected to that feeling? How old does this part feel? How do you feel toward this part of you? I'll give a brief example here. I once had a gal that came in and she brought a photo of herself at age 2. And she holds this, there's a Polaroid photo, holds this Polaroid up and she says, "Who could love this ugly baby?" Right? That was how she felt toward that young part of self. And if we put that young 2-year-old in the chair, there was no compassion. That child is an unlovable child. That's how strong that introject was, right? So what we needed to find is another source of compassion for the 2-year-old self, because the introject of rejection was so strong toward that young part of self. And initially I said, is there anybody that you could imagine loving this little 2-year-old self? No way. Nobody could love this little 2-year-old self. And so then I explored, well, can you think of a different 2-year-old that maybe could be loved? Well, I have this friend, her name is Rachel, and she's a good mom, and I can imagine her loving her son when he was 2. Okay. I want you to imagine Rachel and her son. And I want you to create in your mind a new picture, a new Polaroid, right, of what it looks like when Rachel is holding her son and being very loving to him. And she creates this picture in her mind, and she tells me about it, and she's holding him, and he's looking up at her, and it's a sweet little picture. And, how do you think that Rachel feels when she's caring for this little boy? You might recognize this one from Philip Manfield, right? This is dyadic resourcing. So if anyone in here is familiar with the dyadic resourcing protocol in EMDR, this is where this comes from. So she says that she imagines Rachel, she feels really loving, she feels really caring toward this 2-year-old self, or 2-year-old son. And then, how do you think Rachel feels in her body? She feels warmth. She feels just this natural love. Could you imagine being Rachel, being so caring for Rachel's son. She could do that. Could you imagine how that feels in your body? She could feel that. Because again, she's providing it for Rachel's son. This is not for her. Okay? So she got a sense of that care system and what that feels like in her own body. All right, now go back to the picture and imagine Rachel's son. He's 2 years old. He's being held by Rachel. What do you think that, he's feeling right now? He feels good. He knows that his mommy loves him. He knows that he's cared for. He knows that he's safe. Right? And how do you think that he feels in his body right now? He feels soft. He feels cuddly. He feels like he doesn't have to worry about a thing. How wonderful. How wonderful. She could access this. This was great. All right. And what do you think that he did to deserve Rachel's love? We're listening really carefully here. Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. He just happened to get born into that. It's his birthright. It's everybody's birthright. Could you imagine being Rachel's son? What would you feel in your body if you could imagine being him in this picture? And she could feel it. What do you feel in your body right now? She's crying at this point. She can feel it. What it feels like to have been loved. And this is what you deserved. This is what it should have been like for you, right? So we couldn't necessarily get it for her own 2-year-old self yet, but we could work our way toward that, right? Now she can imagine Rachel holding her 2-year-old self. She's still hard for her to hold her 2-year-old self, but she can pull Rachel in. Rachel holds her 2-year-old self. So we caught the missing need, which was for nurturance. It really was for all of it: nurturance, boundaries, protection, and wisdom. And we found an ally in this friend Rachel. Now, sometimes this is an example where someone was able to find a real person in their life, but sometimes allies are harder to find. Right? And so you can get very creative in helping someone find an ally in an animal, a magical creature. I think I mentioned yesterday Kuan Yin came into my room last week. Archangel Michael came in once. It was really cool. All different wizards, shamans, Mother Teresa, whoever you want, right? Like Jesus, whatever it fits in the belief system of the individual. Because again, I don't have to know. We just need to find an ally. All right? And so we can pull in allies that can meet the missing needs. Sometimes, and this came up in a conversation with one of you at the break yesterday, sometimes there's a question of like, would you ever allow you, the therapist, to be the ally for a young part of your client? Yes, if I use myself in the third person. Could you imagine Arielle going back in time and being there with that young you? Okay. I'll share one more example here real quick, and I know you guys we've got 4 minutes before our break. Okay, I'm going to be timely with our break today. So I'll give one more brief example. So this is a woman who had experienced domestic violence in her household, and she had one very specific memory of her. It's kind of a big story, so just breathe through it and know that she's okay and everyone is okay. But her father had taken out a gun, and she and her mother did not know if he was going to shoot himself or her mother. And so her mother said to her, she was about 14 at the time, go run in the backyard and hide. And so she ran into the backyard and is hiding alone behind the shed, not knowing whether or not father is going to kill her mother, himself, or both. And so she's terrified. She is terrified. And so we imagine what her 14-year-old self needed, right? She, of course, at some level needed to go in and save mom and dad and take away the gun, and she wanted to be the fighter in all of this. But what we did do is we walked her adult self into this picture. And she said, will you come with me, Arielle? I said, yeah, I'll go with you. So we walked her adult self, and I went by her side, Arielle in the third person, and we walked behind the shed where she was hiding. And we stood there, and I said, can you look into the eyes of your 14-year-old self? what is it that you see in the eyes of yourself? What is it that you're feeling as you're standing there alone? I'm terrified. I'm shaking. I am so scared. I don't know what to do. I'm frozen, right? And so we go back in and we allow herself to see herself and to process what that was like, and to basically, like, she just has us go in, and then she's like, and then I need my dog there, and I want my husband now to be there, and she just wraps that part of her around with the most love and care and protection. And the good part about this story is that he didn't shoot anybody, and he actually used that as the turning point in his life, where he went and got sober. And so that we could actually tag into the end of the story, in which things got better from that point forward. He got sober and Mom got help, okay? And not that it was all rainbows and unicorns, it wasn't that. But she was no longer stuck, because there was part of her that was frozen in that moment, as if the story never continued from that point forward. And that's what we got to unfreeze in that moment. So we will do, I'm just going to read one kind of brief poem, and then I'm going to invite you to take a break. So you can take a breath, let that story go. I'm going to invite you to just receive this for a moment. This is a poem. I don't have the poem here, but it's online if you want to find it, or you can buy Mary Oliver's book. And this poem is called Love, Sorrow. Love, sorrow. She is yours now, and you must take care of what has been given. Brush her hair, help her into her little coat, hold her hand, especially when crossing a street, for think, what if you should lose her? Then you would be sorrow yourself. Her drawn face, her sleeplessness would be yours. Take care. Touch her forehead, that she feel herself not so utterly alone. And smile, that she does not altogether forget the world before the lesson. Have patience in abundance, and do not ever lie or ever leave her, even for a moment, by herself, which is to say, possibly again abandoned. She is strange, mute, difficult, sometimes unmanageable, but remember, she is a child. And amazing things can happen, and you may see, as the two of you go walking together in the morning light, how little by little she relaxes. She looks about her. She begins to grow. We're going to do a little bit more with parts work before we go on. I just had a few more pieces here. One is that to speak about how working with shame is very connected to our parts work, right? And that when shame shows up as an emotion in the room, that we want to be able to name the shame, that we want to be able to kind of recognize that it's there, to identify that, and to also simultaneously know how important it is to regulate ourselves, right? Because if there's any pull to join the client, there's often a pull to shut down with the client in shame. And we want to help the client differentiate between I am bad to I feel bad. Right? I feel bad right now, because I am bad makes that shame or that helplessness feeling so pervasive. And we want to be able to stay much more in the present moment, experiential with this work. So we also can help reframe the situation, right? By saying, you were just a child, they were the adults. Especially for those individuals who took over a lot of being the parentified child, right? To borrow from Alice Miller's work, to taking over being that adult in the family. And to, God bless you, to help the client talk back to the shame bully, right? If shame is coming in the form of a self-critic. We can also explore resources for the part of self that's carrying shame, just as we were speaking about before in terms of building some allies. And we can also do that resourcing through through the relational exchange. Is it okay if I'm here with you while you're feeling that shame? Is it okay if I'm looking at you? Because shame often doesn't want to be seen. There's a strong drive to hide inside of shame. And so relationally, to work with our gaze consciously. And sometimes we also can offer to avert our gaze. Because your own eyes, your own gaze in itself is a therapeutic tool. And sometimes we don't really think about that so consciously. We just think it's our job to look at our clients, right? And then we think, oh no, if I look away, then I'm not attuning to my client. But if we consciously offer to avert our gaze, it can actually be very relieving. I had one gal who came in, and every time emotions would come to the surface, she would put her hands over her head. But even then, it was really hard for her to let herself just feel her sadness because she so badly didn't want to be seen. And at some point I said to her, how would it feel for you? Can we do an experiment if when that feeling comes up, if I just let you know that I'm going to take my gaze and look down at the floor for a few moments? And so we did that as an experiment. She said that would be okay. And the feeling came up and I said, okay, right here, I'm just going to look away. And she just let herself cry. And to not be under the lens, because in her family system, to be observed had such a strong kind of critical, invasive quality to it that it felt like such a permission to be given space, even from the lens of being witnessed. And then I would say, is it okay for me to bring my gaze back? And she would say yes. So you can use that as a conscious intervention. And my mentor, who I mentioned before, my consultant, his name was Jim Knipe, he would talk about how shame can sometimes be the safe place for the client, right? That there's a way in which going to shame is safer than confronting that my world was unsafe. All right? And so to stay inside of that, it makes it hard for that to move because that then I have to confront all of the traumatic material. The shame itself then becomes a defense. All right. Yes, please.
So thinking about differentiating the I am versus I feel, in mental health we have this pattern of referring to clients by their disorder. Saying, I have this schizophrenic client versus this client with or this alcoholic versus this client with use disorder. So working with folks who have trauma, how do we what can we do in terms of avoiding that unintentional reinforcement of that shame talk?
Great. So just to repeat the question of, in regards to differentiation language between I am bad versus I feel bad, that same language is very relevant to clients' diagnoses. So instead of saying I am a schizophrenic, I am a person that it has schizophrenia, right? I am a person who has experienced traumatic events. There was an article that I read yesterday that was just in the New York Times last week. I don't know if any of you saw it. I posted it on my Facebook page last night. That is about a woman's journey of recovery from her own trauma. And she talked about how, in her experience, she does not want to identify as a survivor, because even the language of being a trauma survivor implies that the trauma is an identifying factor for her. And I thought that was a really cool nuance in there. And so, to work with the client on what is the language that works for them. I think, is the most important piece. Because actually there are some people who do want to identify as a survivor, that is a very empowering term. And for this woman, very clearly that means that the trauma still defined her. And I thought that was so powerful. So we really work with our clients on what is the language that's most freeing and empowering. Good question. Thank you. So we'll do just a brief self-compassion practice here for you, and I'll offer this as, you can do this in two different ways. One is that if you want to work with what we were touching on before, of yourself sitting with a difficult client, or someone that touches off some difficult feelings for you, that's a better way of putting it, right? And or you can choose an image or a snapshot of a moment within the context of your own childhood or your own family of origin. You really get to choose where you want to go with this. But what we're going to offer is just a little mini experience of you connecting to yourself, a source of your own compassion and wisdom, and to imagine your today self. And you can take a moment to really call in that kind of wise, compassionate care system in yourself. Feel your own empowerment. And imagine this today self going into an image of either you sitting with that difficult client or an image from your childhood, whatever you choose. And bringing with you the most loving, compassionate presence into that image. So you're walking your today self into an image of yourself, either a younger version of yourself or more recent version of yourself sitting in a difficult moment. And I want you to imagine that your today self is going into that image, looking at yourself, your either young self or other image, with the most compassionate, loving eyes. What emotion do you see on your face? What does that part of you need the most? And can you allow your now self to meet that need? And if you'd like, you can bring in any other allies into that image, whether they're people or animals or spiritual figures, fictional, anyone else that you would like to be there with you. Taking a few breaths here. Honoring whatever arises in your awareness. And if this feels complete, allowing it to close here, or if you need to make an agreement with this part of you that you want to bring that back either to your own therapy or to your own supervision, just making an agreement if there's anything that's unresolved. And then slowly bringing your awareness back in. So, how was that? Anyone notice anything? Was it satisfying? Was it hard? Was that difficult for anyone? Okay. Well, we're going to move forward, and this might feel like a bit of a jump, so just get ready for it. We're going to talk about CBT after parts work. Like, whoa, we just stepped into another world. But my biggest hope is that it actually doesn't have to feel like too big of a jump. All right? That